Korea, late 1950. Intelligence analysts were poring over bizarre, mysterious camera footage and impossible combat reports. The evidence was baffling. American airplanes seemed to be under attack by a strange new entity. The hostile aircraft bore Chinese markings, but their tactics were something else entirely. Perfect high-altitude climbs, disciplined formations, lethal ambush techniques from 30,000 feet. American F-86 Sabres, once dominant in the Korean skies, had fallen prey, and B-29 Superfortresses, the pride of the Air Force, were now relegated to flying hidden under cover of darkness. Someone unseen was haunting the skies over MiG Alley. Intercepted radio chatter and alleged glimpses of secret markings offered only hints, but the U.S. military was about to uncover one of the most dangerous secrets of the Cold War. Pilots without a country. At the start of the Korean War in June 1950, American forces ruled the skies. In offices far removed from the front lines, Joseph Stalin was quietly observing. The Soviet leader understood how grave the stakes were. A complete American victory in Korea would place American forces directly on the Soviet Union's eastern doorstep and potentially destabilize Communist China, barely a year into its own revolution. The entire global communist struggle could collapse if the US gained a decisive total victory in the region. Stalin had no intention of letting that happen. However, he also had no desire for a direct confrontation with the United States. He settled for a calculated, middle-of-the-road solution. Soviet involvement in the air war would remain a state secret, hidden even from his own people, while the pilots themselves would be sent into combat incognito, flying under false identities and unmarked aircraft. They would be both secret agents and combat pilots. Elite Soviet aviators, many veterans of World War II, were handpicked for a mission few would ever be publicly recognized for. Among them were figures like Evgeny Popelyev, Nikolai Sutyagin, and Sergei Kramarenko, names known to few in the West, but legends in the squadrons that flew over the Korean peninsula. They belonged to the newly created 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, or IAK, a formation that would grow to include over 500 MiG-15 jet fighters. With its powerful climb rate and high-altitude performance, the MiG was the only aircraft in the communist arsenal capable of challenging the US F-86 Sabre. The first Soviet pilots arrived in Manchuria in the summer of 1950. They operated out of bases in Chinese territory, Antung, Miaogo, Dapu, never crossing the Yalu River on the ground, but flying missions over North Korea daily. Their aircraft bore no Soviet markings. Pilots were instructed to avoid speaking Russian over the radio and fake Chinese or Korean accents if forced to communicate during combat. Their flight suits were altered to resemble those of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Stalin's directive was absolute. If a pilot was shot down, he was to be disavowed. Despite the rigid secrecy, American pilots quickly sensed they were facing opponents with training far beyond that of the North Korean or Chinese armaments they'd previously encountered. The new MiG-15s flew in tight formations, executed sharp turns and vertical climbs with precision, and struck with devastating skill and intent. It was clear something was going on over the skies of Korea. MiG Alley Massacre. On April 12, 1951, 29 B-29 Superfortresses of the U.S. Bomber Command took to the sky, heavy with ordnance and guarded by layers of jet escorts. Their objective: strike deep into North Korea and dismantle the communist airfield infrastructure being hastily constructed near Namsi and Taechung. But what awaited them above the Yalu River was not another token skirmish with antiquated prop planes. It was an ambush. The MiG-15s of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps had been waiting. Over 44 Soviet fighters, launched from Chinese bases, scrambled in trains to meet the Americans head-on. From the start, the skies over MiG Alley were a maelstrom of smoke trails, flak bursts, and cannon fire. Leading the charge was Major Dmitry Oskin of the 17th IAP. In a display of surgical lethality, Oskin tore through two separate bomber formations. First, he blasted B-29 number 4294045 from the 371st Bomb Squadron out of the sky. Then, looping around and coming back in for another pass, he downed B-29 number 4461940 of the 372nd Squadron. Both bombers spiraled into the Yellow Sea, taking their entire 12-man crews with them. No parachutes, no survivors. Moments later, more bombers came under fire. Captain Bakev and Senior Lieutenant Dyachenko of the 523rd IAP inflicted catastrophic damage on two more superfortresses, B-29 number 4427347 and number 4486295. Though these aircraft limped back to Kimpo Air Base in South Korea, they crash-landed with casualties aboard and were so battered they were later written off as scrap. But the MiG pilots were far from finished. Senior Lieutenant Nikolaev, also from the 17th IAP, delivered another hammer blow by downing B-29 number 4487760 of the 370th Bomb Squadron. Some of the American crew managed to eject. Others perished. The survivors were captured and marched into communist captivity. Meanwhile, Captain Bykov mauled another bomber, number 4461816, which barely made it back to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa before being stripped for spare parts. Then, Captain Beechkoff hit number 4486376, the only B-29 from the entire mission to land safely and intact at Kimpo. Black Thursday. The scale of the carnage was unprecedented. Soviet pilots darted in with disciplined aggression, executing high-speed diving attacks, cannon fire tearing into the massive bomber's wings and engines. The lumbering B-29s, designed for high-altitude precision bombing in World War II, were no match for the newer, faster MiG-15s in direct confrontation. The Soviet tactic was brutal but effective. Strike fast, retreat to altitude, and attack again in slashing passes from multiple directions. Even with support from F-84s and Sabres, the American gunners couldn't keep up. By the end of the engagement, dozens of crewmen were lost or wounded. Some parachuted into enemy hands. The tail gunner of one B-29, Sergeant Jerry Webb, did manage to fire a burst into the MiG of Nikolaev, damaging it before he too was captured on the ground. Only one American pilot, Major Richard Creighton of the 336th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, claimed a victory that day, shooting down Senior Lieutenant Curtin from the 523rd RAP. It was a small consolation amid a bloodbath. In the U.S. Bomber Command's own records, the events of that day were later etched in grim shorthand. Black Thursday. The shockwaves were immediate. General Vandenberg, chief of the U.S. Air Force, grounded all B-29s from operations over Korea. From that moment on, the once proud superfortresses would only fly by night. The myth of unchallenged American air superiority had been shattered. The bombers could no longer roam the skies freely. Now, they had to slip through the darkness to survive. For the Soviets, it was a triumphant display of both strategy and secrecy. Their pilots returned home quickly, mission complete, victory confirmed by gun camera footage, debris on the sea, and enemy silence. Yet not a single Soviet insignia was visible, and no formal declaration of engagement was ever made. Black Thursday also cemented the reputation of the 64th IAK and its pilots, men who fought in silence, fell in the shadows, and reshaped the war from 30,000 feet above. The official word from North Korea and China was that these new flight wings were Soviet-trained Chinese pilots. It was a plausible scenario. The U.S. knew Soviet pilots had been sent to China to train its pilots, and that some of the squadrons had even been equipped with the devastating MiG-15 jet. But Americans weren't buying it. There was no way these pilots had become so lethal just in training. These men had combat experience. Testing the ghosts. It wasn't hard to tell. Soviet pilots exhibited advanced tactical behavior that distinguished them from their Chinese or North Korean allies. They flew in tight formations, executed advanced aerial maneuvers, and operated with exemplary discipline and coordination. Nevertheless, the U.S. government refrained from publicly accusing the USSR. They believed they could deal with these secret Soviet pilots, all while avoiding escalation into World War III. Soviet MiG-15 pilots adopted a tactic of funnel ambush, using the Yalu River as a geographic trigger line. They'd wait for Sabres to cross into North Korea, then pounce. They also mimicked the escape behavior of Sabre pilots, who often dove rapidly to disguise Soviet retreat as part of a larger tactical feint. Soon, the Americans decided to test the real capabilities of these Soviet wings. They wanted to study how they behaved and how far they were willing to go to ambush U.S. forces and keep their identities secret. On April 1, 1952, American Sabre pilots took to the sky to find these Soviet pilots and show them that this conflict was not theirs to fight. The Soviet 324th Fighter Aviation Division had just begun its third combat tour in Korea. Still sharpening its coordination and adjusting to a new rotation of pilots, the division found itself thrust into a whirlwind that escalated hour by hour. The first indication came when they spotted a formation of 40 F-86 Sabres over the Pakchan area, maneuvering aggressively and clearly looking for a fight. The Soviets responded in kind, launching a rapid counteroffensive. Their MiG-15s rose to meet the American jets in tight combat spirals that blurred altitude, formation, and direction. Tracer rounds cut arcs across the sky, and the air buzzed with combat calls over scrambled radio waves. Shortly after this, the second engagement ignited in the Suncheon-Kusong sector, where another flight from the Soviet 494th IAP collided with 16 more Sabres. The Americans fought with their typical tenacity, their Sabres darting in and out of clouds, attempting to exploit their jets' superior maneuverability at lower altitudes. But the Soviets had numbers, coordination, and altitude on their side. In both clashes, pilots from the 494th claimed a total of 4 enemy aircraft downed. The third encounter occurred when a full regiment from the 176th Guards IAP encountered 8 F-86s. The Sabres were probing deep, trying to catch MiGs off guard as they returned from patrol. Instead, they found themselves ambushed by an aggressive and highly disciplined Soviet formation. According to Soviet after-action reports, 5 Sabres alone were downed in that engagement. The long flight back. Among those Soviet pilots who left a mark on that day was Senior Lieutenant V.I. Mukriv. After the fierce dogfight, his MiG-15 looked like a sieve, riddled with bullet holes and severely damaged. He'd taken a wound to the neck. He felt weak and on the edge of losing consciousness, but refused to eject. He and the other Soviet pilots technically did not exist, and he was bound by honor to do anything in his power to keep any evidence that the Soviets were involved in the Korean War away from the Americans. With fire alarms screaming and hydraulic systems failing, Mukriv coaxed his damaged MiG back across the Yalu River and landed it in what could only be described as a miracle of piloting and nerve. Others were not as fortunate. 2 MiGs from the 176th crashed while landing, damaged beyond recovery during the firefights. A third pilot, too wounded to eject, perished in his cockpit. Throughout the day, Soviet pilots flew 48 combat sorties and claimed 9 F-86 Sabres shot down. They did this while losing only 2 MiGs to enemy fire. The significance of the day was not lost on Soviet command. The 64th IAK had gone on the offensive for the first time in weeks, and it had paid off. There was a strange, sharp energy among the Soviet pilots that evening. The briefings were tense but celebratory. Names like Senior Lieutenant Mukriv, Captain Kramarenko, and Colonel Karasev were passed around the barracks with respect. Mechanics patted fuselages, repaired under fire. Ground crews hoisted cannon barrels from MiGs scorched by near misses and airframe fires. American records for that day told a different story. Minimal losses, if any. As always, discrepancies remained unresolved. Gun camera footage was analyzed. Reconnaissance photos were scrutinized, and amid the propaganda and pride, the truth floated somewhere in the jet wash of conflicting reports. What was certain was this. On April 1st, 1952, the Soviet Air Force had clawed back a piece of the sky. Saving Sokolov. By 1953, the air war over Korea had changed. The era of Soviet pilots taking the Americans by storm was over. U.S. pilots were adapting, not just to the aircraft, but to the men who flew them. F-86 Sabre pilots were learning how to counter high-speed slashing attacks, how to bait MiGs into dives they couldn't follow, and how to survive bursts of cannon fire that had once guaranteed defeat. The Soviets, still shackled by Stalin's iron demand for total secrecy, often operated under strict radio silence, and when they had to communicate, they had to pretend to be speaking Chinese or Korean, a charade that eroded their ability to quickly respond to shifting combat situations. They were forced to fight without the support or flexibility enjoyed by their adversaries. On January 14, 1953, the 224th IAP was scrambled in response to an alert near the Supung hydroelectric station. The regiment launched in staggered flights. at 11,000 meters, a pair of F-86s appeared to their left, glinting against the pale winter sun. Squadron Commander Major M.G. Doroshenko banked toward them, leading the attack. Close behind were Captain V.T. Smorganov and his wingman, Sergei Ilyashenko, followed by others in formation. From below, another pair of Sabres burst upward like sharks breaching for prey. Smorganov reacted instantly, firing on the lead Sabre. Its wingman rolled into a dive. Smorganov shouted for Ilyashenko to pursue, and he did, only to be ambushed himself. Cannon fire tore through his MiG-15. Instruments failed. The radio went quiet. Flames engulfed the fuselage. Ilyashenko barely managed to eject, plummeting into the open sky. Smorganov scored a victory. Doroshenko damaged another. But the price was high. The ice below. Elsewhere in the chaos, Senior Lieutenant N.P. Sokolov, diving from 15,000 meters through cloud cover, broke through at low altitude, straight into the crosshairs of another Sabre pair. His MiG was shredded before he could even react. He ejected and floated downward, drifting toward the frozen surface of the Suprum Reservoir. Senior Lieutenant B.N. Siskov was already engaged. Contrails and cannon bursts laced the sky. Flight Leader Mironov and his wingman closed in. Sokolov's wingman, Askald German, circled the parachute in a desperate bid to protect him. Siskov and Klimov joined. Then Doroshenko arrived, the sky filled with MiGs. From the ground, a single white speck was seen floating slowly downward. Sokolov. American Sabres, marked with yellow bands, rushed toward him like vultures to a carcass. But the Soviets weren't going to let them. They threw themselves into the path of the attackers. An all-out dogfight ignited above the reservoir. Fighters broke and reformed. MiGs roared in and out of formation, cannon fire slashing past canopies. Seconds stretched into what seemed like forever. Finally, a message over the radio, quote, "The vultures are leaving. The parachutist has landed. You are to descend. Return home." But they already knew. The ice didn't hold. As Sokolov recovered from the touchdown, the surface cracked. The weight of his gear and the drag of his chute tipped him forward. He sank headfirst through the ice, struggling as the parachute cords tugged him deeper. No rescue was possible. Sokolov was gone beneath the ice. In total, the 64th IAK claimed 3 F-86s shot down and 1 damaged. The cost, 2 MiGs lost and 1 pilot. American pilots from the 4th and 51st FIWs, by contrast, claimed they downed 8 MiGs, a number clearly inflated, likely counting losses from multiple squadrons, including the Chinese. Official U.S. records admit to the loss of just 1 Sabre that day, F-86F number 5112950. The pilot, Colonel John Mitchell, managed to nurse his crippled aircraft home and land safely. A silent victory. The final weeks of Soviet aerial involvement in the Korean War were marked by quiet attrition. The once overwhelming MiG squadrons of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps no longer entered combat from a position of strength. Time, tactics, and technology had eroded their edge. By mid-1953, American pilots had not only become intimately familiar with the patterns and habits of their Soviet counterparts, but they were also equipped with a potent new weapon, the F-86F Sabre. This updated model featured a more powerful engine and an improved wing design that enhanced maneuverability at higher altitudes, where most MiG and Sabre encounters took place. It was also fitted with an advanced radar gun sight, making it easier to hit fast-moving targets. These upgrades decisively tilted the balance. The MiG-15, once the undisputed ruler of MiG Alley, was now matched and often outclassed in its own arena. Over the course of 3 grueling years, the 64th IAK flew over 64,000 combat sorties. Soviet pilots claimed more than 1,300 enemy aircraft destroyed, a figure hotly disputed by post-war analysis, but indicative of the scale of their effort. Soviet aces like Yevgeny Popelyev and Nikolai Sutyagin became legends among their peers, with each claiming over 20 victories, a remarkable feat in the age of jet combat. Yet their names remained largely unknown to the outside world, their achievements buried under layers of state secrecy and Cold War deniability. Soviet airmen bloodied the nose of the US Air Force and denied it total domination of the skies. For much of the war, the skies over northwestern Korea were heavily contested. This contested airspace allowed Chinese and North Korean forces to move and regroup without the constant threat of unchallenged high-altitude bombing, which had proven so devastating in World War II. The MiG units protected key infrastructure, bridges, and supply routes, giving the troops on the ground a fighting chance. Equally important was their role in education and capacity building. The Soviet Union used the Korean War as a proving ground, not only for hardware, but for doctrine and training. Hundreds of Chinese and North Korean pilots were trained under the tutelage of experienced Soviet instructors. These were not simple technical tutorials. They involved complex tactics, such as coordinated multi-squadron dogfighting and radar-guided interception. In time, these students would form the backbone of their nation's post-war air forces. Yet the Soviets failed in critical ways. Their strategy suffered from systemic flaws. Victory claims on both sides were exaggerated, but the Soviet side often inflated figures for political approval. Entire fighter regiments were rotated in and out of the theater every few months, a practice that robbed units of hard-earned experience just as pilots began to understand the dynamics of jet warfare. This churn in personnel, dictated more by internal politics than by tactical necessity, led to avoidable losses and missed opportunities. Rigid doctrine often prioritized obedience over innovation. Pilots were sometimes forbidden to engage unless certain parameters were met, orders that left them watching helplessly as allies were downed. Political secrecy added another cruel twist. Because the USSR officially denied its involvement, Soviet pilots flew under assumed Chinese or Korean identities. Shot down airmen, if captured, were abandoned. Others were buried anonymously, often in unmarked graves. Their families back home were told nothing. Some widows learned of their husbands' fates decades later, only after the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Even those who survived the war were silenced. Many were barred from discussing their service for the rest of their lives, their wartime records sealed away in archives labeled top secret. When the armistice came on July 27, 1953, it brought no celebration. Soviet pilots landed, shut down their engines, and were quietly rotated out of Korea. Some received medals in secret ceremonies. Others got nothing.